So I will just start us off. My name is Robert Feldstein. I work at a small consulting firm working on public sector issues in the Puget Sound called Cedar River Group. I've been staffing and supporting sound communities in different capacities for the last 2 years, more intensely in the last year. And I'm going to briefly let the two sort of presenters join, and Toby, who's helping doing outreach and organizing, and then we'll go into the presentation. Jesse?
Hey, quick intro. I'm Jesse Simpson. I work for the Housing Development Consortium, also providing some staff support to sound communities as we're pushing forward housing benefit districts. And I'm the government relations and policy manager here. Peter?
Peter Orser. I'm retired, but not very well. And I work quite a bit on sound communities issues, but also work with the Runstad Department of Real Estate at the UW, Green Canopy, a small builder in Seattle. I'm a home builder in my yesteryear as the CEO of the Weyerhaeuser Real Estate Company. So housing advocate is my new title.
Toby.
Toby Crittenden, and have been in and around sort of public policy in Seattle and Washington State for the last little while, and have been come on this fall to work with Robert and the team on getting some of these conversations together so that we can have a productive 2023.
Yeah, and I just want to say I'm really grateful and thankful for all of you giving the time. Housing is maybe one of, if not the, certainly one of the most critical issues in our area in this time. Lots of pressures on you, and so giving up some time to come talk to us and hear about our idea is great. And we hope it's a chance for you to learn and listen, but also to give us feedback. You know, we've been kicking this idea around and refining it, but it's also a chance for us to keep making it better to fit more of what people need. So without further ado, well, ask questions as you go along, use the chat, and we can respond as appropriate. But if you have a pressing issue or clarification, you can raise your hand or verbally, because sometimes it's hard to see with the share screen. And we will start the presentation. So welcome all. And I'm going to share the presentation. All right. Peter, you want to start us off? Or Jed, I guess.
Sure, can you do that? Yep, so little intro, just run of plans. I'm going to provide sort of a conceptual background for why we're talking about housing benefit districts and why I think we need this sort of land banking strategy to be scaled up in Washington State. Then Peter is going to give much more detailed description of how the housing benefit districts themselves work before we close out by talking through what we envision as next steps for the legislative session. Next slide. Little just overview of sound communities. It's a group that got started up. Peter, you know a bit more about the background of this, but it's been my understanding that you've been working through this notion of housing benefit districts for the last 3 or 4 years, really centered on how do we leverage the transit investments that the Puget Sound region is making through light rail to complete those investments with substantial complete communities, including big amounts of housing and affordable housing around those station areas. And what are the policy mechanisms that can be used to support the emergence of those complete trans-oriented communities. Just broad scale, the Puget Sound region is seeing a huge expansion in light rail and bus rapid transit over the coming years. If you look closely at that map, it's showing at least a somewhat recent projection of light rail extensions throughout the Puget Sound area, showing our extensions up to Linwood in the north by 2024, to Redmond in the east by 2024, and to the south to Federal Way. It's now 2025, along with the 405 BRT. And then that's not even including all of the subsequent Sound Transit 3 investments that will extend the system out to Everett, Tacoma, Issaquah, and whatnot.
76 station opportunities.
Yep, 76 stations. You did the math on how many that could accommodate, right? If you just think about, well, 10,000 easily. If you think about how we need to grow as a region, looking at the vision that the Puget Sound Regional Council has laid out, and how all of the growth plans of the jurisdictions throughout our central Puget Sound region, it's really focused a lot on growing around transit. The flip side of all of this transit investment is that to the extent that the transit is perceived as being valuable, that value is priced into the land. This is fairly fundamental aspect of real estate economics. And the nature of just typical market rate redevelopments after upzones is that there's pretty little public capture of that benefit. And alongside that, if no compensatory policies are put into place, there's pretty strong gentrification and displacement pressures that come with that added value. And so you can come at this from multiple angles, but I think just the clear takeaway to me is that we need more housing of all types near transit, more affordable housing, more total housing, both to leverage the investments that we've made in transit, to create more sustainable greenhouse gas emissions free communities, and to create more equitable communities and more affordable homes. And the kicker of all of this is that currently there's very little to govern the development of the communities around station areas. Why don't you click to the next slide? Erica, yes, we'll also get into more detail about homeownership later. So currently, the region has made some pretty strong strides in terms of establishing equitable transit-oriented development, so more affordable developments near transit at the exact station locations that Sound Transit owns. Because of a series of advocacy efforts, they have established the 80-80-80 rule, where they have to offer 80% of the suitable surplus property to affordable housing developers, make 80% of the homes affordable to people earning less than 80% of area median income. This rule, as well as Sound Transit's other policies around land disposition, have resulted in great developments right at some of our new light rail stations. Pictured here is one of them, Cedar Crossing. It's 254 new affordable homes with childcare and a bunch of ground floor retail. Great development. Everyone's very happy to talk about it. All of the policymakers who help play a role in it like to talk about it. And the big problem is it's one development. Since 2006, more than 2,500 new homes have been developed in that station area around the new Roosevelt light rail station, but that is the only multifamily affordable housing development. So even with this, with high intensity development of affordable housing at the station location, you're just getting about 10% of the units as affordable. And there's no plan for future developments. And so I guess the way I think about housing benefit districts is like, we've done a lot of work on thinking about how we can be equitable in disposing of the land that is adjacent to the stations and be more strategic about using that land for community benefits. Housing benefit districts are about expanding that framework out to think about the entire station area around each of the light rail stations. Why don't you click to the next? How I think about this overall is that housing benefit districts are a way of scaling up land banking, which is just a broad strategy to acquire underutilized land for community and public purposes, to a level that we've never seen before throughout the entire state and region. It's a way of ensuring that you've got some public control of key parcels to realize visions that, you know, include affordable housing, but also incorporate, it could be a way to incorporate community priorities around like grocery store access, space for small businesses, space dedicated to some like community serving nonprofits. All of this stuff, land cost is the key barrier to actually realizing it within our current market conditions. I view this kind of land banking, housing benefit districts as a way of just getting in front of those displacement pressures and even reversing them, both increasing housing production and then alleviating the pressure. And then we've got these three priorities for housing benefit districts: being strategic, being, you know, scalable. So assembling the key parcels allows for realizing public vision for station areas, including NBM housing. Then strategic, so focusing resources on a particular geographic area, you know, and then scaling those efforts beyond the particular parcels that happen to be owned by a nonprofit, public entity, or community-based organization. And then finally, the collaborative piece of it, which is that we envision quite a bit of community engagement being involved in the disposition of land that's acquired. And I'll turn it over now to Peter, who's going to talk through more of the logistics of how housing benefit districts can work and scale.
Look, I have a clean slate in front of me. Robert, you're going to help me walk through this, right? There we go. So, of course, the first thing to do is to do the right thing. And before we engage any district or any community engages around HBDs, they really have to demonstrate a commitment to increasing urban residential capacity. And that's why we're focused on the station areas, because that is absolutely the right thing to be doing, with a focus on affordable housing and a public vision for the station at large. With that comes the opportunity then to be funded for land banking. So what that means is, in the front of this process, and we'll talk about when and how and where you get that money, you would have the funds necessary in total through a bonding structure to begin your land banking process. The next step, though, is to be a little bit more intentional about the planning. Doing the right thing requires you to go to the next level of planning to understand the district in detail. And we'll show you some tools that we've developed to help you do that. I think they're part of the money. It needs to be dedicated to the planning exercise up front to ensure you understand the parcels, the demographics, the adjacencies, the community needs, and be thinking intentionally ahead of the game about displacement, not reactively. So with money and a plan and an intent in place, the next step is to begin the process of acquisition. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, of course. Our initial proposal, and we'll talk about different ways to think about this, but that in fact, it needs to be a diverse community across all economic strata to be a complete community with a focus on affordable housing, which includes the very low, and workforce housing, which is the 80 to 120% of median, and then of course, market housing. Now, those percentages can change, but affordability is the priority. So that piece never goes away. But it's important to understand how market rate housing plays into affordable housing. Because in my mind, I think we're actually using the market to our advantage, to the advantage of affordability by, next slide, revolving this fund. So the theory here is as you buy property and you transition it back to the nonprofit provider who's building affordable housing, you can transition it at a subsidized price because you're selling the market rate housing at full market rate. Market rate housing would never have the benefit of land subsidy. And as the process goes on and market appreciation takes place, that market rate housing in effect subsidizes the affordable and workforce housing. But let's just be clear here, that's one transaction. So you got your, let's say, $50 million and you deploy it against those percentages. You are now transitioning and a nonprofit here is buying this back, a market rate there is buying that back, and those dollars are all coming back into the city entity that is managing the HBD for redeployment. So over a 20-year cycle, you're likely to be able to deploy 4, maybe even 5 times the capital. So it keeps getting regenerated to create not just more affordable, but more housing. And I'll show you that in a little bit more detail. So the deploying of the capital is important, but recycling it is just as important. And I see a question, city agency. Each city will have the capacity to build an entity, likely with the help of outside help like Housing Finance Commission for back office work. But this is a city managed entity. I liken it to an economic development office. There will be a person who is doing this work in conjunction with the planning department to acquire and assemble and recycle this money at the city level. It could be state money, but deployed at the city level. So next slide, please. So we tested this concept with the University of Washington project in Tacoma, Everett, and Renton. And we gave them each hypothetically monopoly money, $50 million of acquisition, $25 million worth of infrastructure deployment. And we worked with a coding organization called City Builder to identify a half-mile radius. This is the Everett station. And you can see that the blues are areas of opportunity. The reds are areas that are pretty well developed. And that's what the geocoding gave us, was information about the property to see its assessed value versus its market value. And you can tell a lot of things from public data about availability and accessibility. So then they took the bluer sites and deployed their capital on the right in 3 different phases. You can see light blue, pinkish, and greenish, and they deployed it in these cycles, and they had a strategy of where was phase 1, phase 2, what were the adjacencies. You can see some of these sites are right next to each other, creating assemblies, and the net effect, next slide. The net effect is, in the Everett example, we actually have more housing. So you see in the left-hand chart with HBD, we actually have more housing units, but in the yellow, you can see, and the blue, you can see extraordinarily more affordable and extremely affordable housing types, because we deployed that 34, 33, 33% model in this particular case. But the other thing that people don't talk about is when you have more housing, when you have more economic development, when you have more vitality, you actually generate more local tax revenue. So an ancillary benefit of this is, you can see on the right-hand side that sales tax, B&O, property tax revenues are all up substantially because there's more activity. Of all kinds, businesses, housing, land transactions, create taxable environments. So next slide. So one of the things we've learned over the last 3 years is that this tool is actually in and of itself a anti-displacement tool, because it allows us to engage early on and be intentional about the properties we acquire, how we manage the transitions, how we think about the next steps, how we either prevent or return people to their community. And part of this is also local business displacement. The Hilltop is a great example. That is a lot of really important local businesses in that center area. And so here's an example of Othello Square, which is uniquely in sort of a faux transit-oriented development in the Seattle Housing Authority parcel. But it has engaged in a variety of types of housing and public services, nonprofit and otherwise, as well as commercial services in that building. So being at the front of the train gives us an opportunity to really think about displacement, both for housing and businesses. Next slide. Somebody asked the home ownership question, and that is a really good one. And I would repeat what I'm saying here. This is really of late, and rightly so, come to the top of the heap of focus for all of us, which is how do we think about home ownership in this context? Well, the same issues of affordability, of a displacement are all relevant here. And we need to be thinking about how we change those units over and add units and create home ownership opportunities. Now, you know, by reducing the cost and securing the land, all the things that are relevant to affordable rental are also affordable to home ownership. But the opportunity here is to be intentional in the front end to create some home ownership opportunities. And that can come in a lot of different forms, all the way to co-ops. So there's no limit on the different kinds of rental or ownership opportunities that are created here. But we have the opportunity to think about it and act on it financially in the front end. Next slide. This is not new. I and my teammates are not brilliant geniuses coming up with this in the laboratory. TOD certainly isn't new, but the notion of land banking for good, if you will, has been deployed in a lot of different places: Denver, Atlanta, Los Angeles. And I love this quote. I think, Robert, you put this in. The creation of land bank pilot is an important step in supporting the existing affordable housing infrastructure and fostering an increased stock of affordable housing, especially in underserved communities. The land bank pilot would save money for the county over time by purchasing land for future affordable housing programs. You're saving money because you're buying it before the land is appreciated 37% when the station comes in. You're buying land because you are ahead of the market game with capital in hand to go out and act. And then that's my point. Take advantage of that market to support affordability. Next slide. Okay, so we've been working through a grant through the Department of Commerce on trying to help think about how cities might take this on. So we created a grant to provide 3 tools: 1, an action guide; 2, an impact model, understanding of financial implications; and 3, sort of a GIS knowledge base, understanding the property and the demographics of a district. So I'll show you each one of those. Next slide. The document itself, the action guide, is really a user manual, if you will, to think about how to do this, understanding it, establishing the framework, understanding the finance, implementation, all the way down to home ownership. But it was important that we learned as much doing this because of the review process that we went through with some very engaged public agencies. The 3 cities where we did our pilot were very engaged: Sound Transit, Puget Sound Regional Council. Josh actually sits on our subcommittee, but we've had really good feedback, and we're happy to be here today to continue to take feedback. But more than anything, this is the base manual, if you will. The tool, next slide. The first tool is an impact model. So when I said that you can deploy this property to buy 34%, 33, and 33, you see in the upper left-hand blue box. And then when you sold it, you can see in the green box, you sold it at market rate, meaning we want 100% of whatever the market is. But we, in this model, did a recapture of only 90%, which in effect is saying, we're going to sell it back to you for the price that we purchased it, so that you do not pay the market appreciation. And we'll hold it while you get your permits and while you get your funding together, but where the price is not going to go up and you're not going to have to hold it and pay the operating costs. So in effect, it's a subsidy. But there's other ways to do that. So in the lower chart, scenario B is more extreme, which it says, no, we don't want anything to do with market rate, which I personally think is a mistake. But for example, here, we're going to do low income and workforce, and we're going to do it 50-50. And because low income is so difficult, we're going to give you the land, 0 recapture, and we're going to get a 50% subsidy on workforce. So let's go to the next slide. So now you can see the effect of what happens here. At the top, red box, 4,657 units are created across the board because we had more money coming back into the system, which allowed us to continue to recycle it 3 and 4 times. And ultimately, well, let me compare first against 1,900 units, because we were actually subsidizing the vertical, which is an okay thing, but it just yields less units. And you can see, if you go to the left, next slide, that in fact, because you got money back and deployed it in 3 or 4 times, you were actually able to place $200 million worth of capital, where in the case where you just subsidized, you were only able to place $61 million, which thus a lower unit count. Neither are bad, it's just different priorities. And I think that's the beauty of where we're going on this, is that each city will be able to decide how they want to deploy it. For me, I like using market appreciation to get more units and deploy more money back into workforce and low income. But that's a mix that will be different in every city. Next slide. So the last tool piece of the equation is this sort of GIS look. And this is shoreline at 185th. You can't see it, but the concept is, you know, red is Sound Transit property, and then the green are properties with the capacity for 200 additional units with an appraised value of ratio of less than 50%, which means that they are ripe to purchase. And those aren't the only ones that would be opportunities. But this tool allows you to understand appraised value versus market value, size, zoning, and most importantly, demographics, so you can anticipate some of the displacement issues that may be inherent in purchasing. So it's a way and free tool to be using to assess your properties and build your acquisition strategy. So those are the 3 tools that we've produced out of this grant. Now we just need the legislation.
Available on our website right now. This is my infomercial moment. Go to the new tools tab on the website and you can get links to any of these. All right.
There you go.
Sign up today and you can get these tools 100% off.
100% off of 0. So I think that's it in a nutshell. And you may have questions at the end and I'll wait for those. But now we probably should tell you where we've been in the legislative strategy of it all and where we want to go.
Yeah, I want to hold for questions a little bit here. If there is any pressing top of mind questions about how it works before we shift into more like legislative strategy.
See, Erica had a hand up.
I have a hand up. Hello. Thank you for this presentation, y'all, and for your great work. 2 questions and like half a comment on the second question. And maybe you're going to get to this with the legislation, but slide 7, where does the original funding come from in step 2? That's my first question. And the second question on 15 and 16, Peter, I heard your preference for more housing units by selling the land for more. Were there actual projects modeled in terms of feasibility? And here's my comment, I know in Seattle, at least for home ownership, because of the lack of leverage available for those types of projects, the land really has to be as low cost as possible, capital FREE. And so
Right.
I know that there's some like push and pull there. Just curious if there were actual projects in that modeling.
Well, we were doing it off of actual land values and understanding the cost generically of what it would take to build a project. And you're right, it's different in Seattle than it is in Everett, but someday Everett's going to be like Seattle, right? And
Right.
to get ahead of it. So it's really conceptual in nature, and I wouldn't want to be held to 1,947 units. It's just using the power of the market. And so Seattle is a good example of that. If we had 3% at market, we would have made a bunch of money because the market took off, and we could have used that horrendous appreciation, which was probably 30%, to actually write down the subsidized version by some number greater than the 10% that I showed you in the chart. So it's a mix and match, and it's a flexibility that is available for each city depending on how their economics work. Where we get the money is, of course, originally started with a self-guided regressive tax by cities. We learned 3 years ago that probably wasn't a really great idea. Let's increase the sales tax so each city can bond against that revenue. That's not going anywhere. So we are in the process, and I'll let these guys talk about it, but we're in the process of working through how the state can assist through an outright grant or some other bonding function. So it really has to come from the state, in our view. Cities, the dirty little secret is cities could go do this right today. There's no rule. We're just trying to provide help and guidelines. They could go do it today, but of course they're not. And so we want to make it easier and find ways to salt the stew with probably state level money. And I think it's, generally speaking, somewhere between 30 and 50 million dollars a station, or mostly by city, except maybe Seattle. And so that's that gets you into some pretty big numbers pretty quickly. And so we're hoping we can get this started with 6 or 7 stations and prove the value of it, and the value to the taxpayers as well as the people who want to live in those units. It's a good use of state money because we're getting ahead of the economy. So that's the strategy.
Give it, Jesse, one other point is that on those 2 scenarios, Erica, they're sort of bookends, right? Like the 2 could be like, you could have 33% in market, but then greatly increase the subsidy for the affordable third, if you will. So you could sort of mix, as Peter says, mix and match. That doesn't have to be all one or the other. We sort of wanted to push the levers sort of either way to see options, and then cities probably would find somewhere in between. But I want to talk a little bit at ledge, because I know people have questions like you about.
But just one more
Sorry.
point. We would never allow or support more than 33% market rate under any circumstances. And we don't think we should be supporting less than 34% low, very low, affordable. And so you could do something that was 100% affordable, which would be very difficult and you wouldn't get many units. But you could also, you can mix and match within those limits. But what you can't do is go to 80% market, because that just defeats the purpose. Sorry, Robert.
Yeah, thanks for that. So on to the money piece. As you heard Peter allude to, this housing benefit district concept started as a concept closely modeled on the transportation benefit districts, which are a way that cities can levy local taxes to invest in particular transportation infrastructure. Embedded in this notion is fully appreciating housing, especially affordable housing, as infrastructure in and of itself. Ran into some political issues around, nobody particularly wants sales tax to go higher because it's regressive. Bit of a sense that property tax might be hitting its fatigue with voters, and also a sense that probably you could get it would be a limited number of cities who would actually be willing to take on this particular revenue authority for the acquisition of land through a housing benefit district. So the next year came back as more of a sales tax credit, the notion being it would be a piloted set of pre-selected 3 or 4 jurisdictions who would be able to credit back against their sales tax contribution to the state government for a period of time, and use that to fund their own housing benefit districts. The option, can you go to the next slide? Option we're settling on as a preferred alternative of going into this next session is departing from that, sticking on the statewide fund for the reasons that I've mentioned and that Peter's mentioned, but going away from the specificity of local sales tax rebate and going towards just a lump sum grant of money from the state coffers. Could be a general obligation bond, which cities can compete for using would be some sort of competitive notice of funding availability that would go out, where our ask is for $250 million for competitive grants, which would enable about 6 or 7 cities to set up housing benefit districts. We think that this particular scope has some benefits in terms of it's more equitable because it does redistribute resources to where they are most effective and where there's the greatest local need, regardless of what their particular sales tax revenue generation is. I think there's some efficiencies of scale when the state is doing the bonding versus particular cities. And you avoid some of the, this goes both ways. You avoid the particular scrapping over why a given revenue source is a good or bad idea, though you also run up against the real constraints of the state budget, which we recognize it's a thing we're going to have to be cognizant of as we go into this next session. I think the big picture, the legislature is calling this year housing year. It's top of mind for many voters, many legislators. They, during the transportation focused year last year, invested $17 billion into transportation. And so getting the state to think about housing as real infrastructure deserving of that scale of investment, and that this land banking strategy with housing benefit districts is a key component of long-term investments in affordable and middle-income housing around our transit stations. I think we are about at the end here. Got some next steps here, but I kind of want to just open it up for more general questions, feedback. Why don't you leave that slide up for a bit? Just as you. Yeah, we're prepping up for the next month and a half before the session starts. We're engaged in lawmaker meetings as well as these sorts of meetings. It's going to take a big push. We realize that. I think the voice of affordable housing developers and operators is going to be incredibly important in terms of actually getting this across the finish line. That can mean engagement on a scale of from like slacktivism, like you sign up for our, oh yeah, can someone drop the links in? Slacktivism from like you're signed up as a supporter, we can use your logo and you'll like click an action alert when we send them out to you, to actually being there, willing to testify. Hopefully they'll still accommodate some remote testimony, so it's not too much travel down to Olympia, but being out there talking to your networks and your state legislators.
You know, I would say we have a better than 50-50 chance. I don't want to be discouraging. It's going to be a tough road because of the economics, but housing is at the top of the list. We've been to the legislature 3 times and worked the bill, and people are aware and people are starting to get the concept. And really what we're putting into the system here is a test. 6 projects, pilot, $250 million, which is equivalent to what they do with the Housing Finance Commission. It's not 17 billion, but we don't have a gas tax either to pay for that. And so it has the potential to be successful. And several cities are very interested and will be very supportive, including Renton, Everett, Shoreline, Tacoma, in seeing something like this pass over the finish line.
Chris, I saw you came on camera. Do you have a question? Still on mute.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, we're only talking about light rail station areas. So areas outside of the Puget Sound east side wouldn't be eligible to become benefit districts. Is that a true statement?
It's a bus rapid transit as well.
I actually would say some of this is a political question as well as a policy question. Like this concept could work elsewhere. You know, if there's a fast foot ferry terminal in Kitsap, and they thought they're engaged and interested. We know Spokane's doing BRT, like, you know, and that's also what's scalable. The money would go further. You may need less of a pot, and if that helps get us the coalition. The origin of this and the focus of this is light rail and that huge investment and the huge capacity that gives. But for policy and political reasons, we also have an open mind on that.
And Renton was one of our pilots. And while they think someday they might be a station, today they're a high capacity transit.
Their BRT. Yeah.
I was, thanks, Robert, just sort of thinking about the east side, or the, you know, the Seattle region versus the rest of the state kind of dichotomy politically and how that plays out. My other thought, if I might, is in my experience. So I mean, just let me understand it. When the government agency acquires the land, then it becomes public becomes public land for some period of time. So that's a question. My comment is, in my experience, governments aren't very nimble when it comes to selling the land that they own, and they can become a little proprietary around it. And sometimes you may be in the middle of a deal and some state legislator comes in and interrupts that deal. It's really complicated. Have you been considering the complications of government entities selling public land?
I understand those pains well. And so I think it is true. I do also think that like we are hoping this, operates slightly in a sort of quasi-governmental capacity where they have a little more freedom to operate outside the general, a lot of the devil's in the details, but sort of purpose bound, probably put some guardrails on what the land can be used for, because even the market sell, governments tend to bestow a lot of benefits on all of their sold property about requirements and everything else. And there's a chance of losing that market appreciation if you put too many requirements. So our hope is that this can be a business done differently for a greater public cause, but we can't promise that right now. I don't have a way of promising. I will just acknowledge that.
I think that is part of the idea of creating an entity that is the housing benefit district, that they'll be separate to an extent from the governing jurisdiction. And I mean, I'd hope that an organization that's set up with the mainly sole purpose of purchasing and disposing of land would be more nimble with regard to that process.
Well,
Might be a little optimistic, but
the other tool, I mean, we're talking about this in the context of 6 or 7 pilot cities acting independently. So the risk is there, but the ultimate use of HBDs would likely include a statewide advisory board that would oversee some of this and approve transactions, if you will. And so that would, in fact, I think, reduce some of the political polarity because there is a decision-making body. And then even now, the Housing Finance Commission has the technical tools, so they would be in support of cities in driving this through. I'm not sure they can overcome the political things that you're talking about, but bringing credibility in terms of how you buy, hold, transfer property, the Housing Finance Commission has those tools.
I mean, I'd see City of Seattle on here, and they, obviously have done a huge, incredible work and investment around TOD, around building of housing, affordable housing, and even then face challenges of selling property as everyone else does. But one of the ways I think about this is cities are having these stations, while they're done to them and are being asked, how are you going to deal with displacement? How are you going to deal with planning? How are you going to deal with building housing and affordability in complete communities? And have limited tools. And this is going to help cities to do a hard thing, and also put some guardrails on it that, like, if you want the money, you're going to have some pretty high density. You're going to have maybe limited parking requirements. I don't know exactly what the rules would be, but try and both encourage and incentivize and give money to cities who want to respond to this, but otherwise just don't have the staffing, policy, or political sort of alignment to get it done on their own. And so, Seattle would benefit. I know there's talk even of Graham or other places, but also getting this distributed so region-wide, other places who couldn't take on the housing. The system's going to work a lot better, as we all know, if other places can also take on some at scale, some of this sort of complete communities and housing. So.
all right, feedback from others. See, Angela Sanfilippo on the line. Any comments on your perspective from like more of a South King?
Not at this point, Jesse. I appreciate the opportunity to check back in on the legislation and where you all are at. I know Renton has been very supportive. I think some of our other South King County cities I haven't heard them take a viewpoint one way or the other. I think they need a better understanding of what it looks like, and you all have done a lot of work to get to that point. So just really appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and learn more.
And good to see you, Angela. We're happy to come and to present to Skip or some other time and sort of however we can help support members' understanding. So we
And
Jesse?
Allison Butcher, I see you from the Master Builders on the line. Any comments from the Master Builders?
Oh, well, thank you for the opportunity to tune in today. I'm always interested in learning more about this. I mean, I'm thinking about it with a couple hats. One is through our work with the Coalition for More Housing Choices and partnering on solutions to support Black home ownership. I mean, this has been identified as a tool that can help with that, and certainly helping with anti-displacement as you described. But what I guess a question I have, thinking about maybe not master builders, but thinking about the market rate housing perspective, because that would be a piece of this under this plan. And I'm just wondering if you are outreaching more with market rate builders who are in the TOD space currently. Our own members at MBA aren't steeped in TOD. There may be a level out of housing types. But it does have me wondering how they figure in and could play a role in supporting this. So just a question I have.
Well, I think that's part of the outreach process. We're talking to the chamber, we're talking to Challenge Seattle, we're talking to Microsoft, Amazon, who are also supporting through their funds, supporting their own initiatives. The Runstead board, which has a lot of commercial and apartment real estate types on it, are aware and engaged. We have a couple people from the UW and on the committee. Yeah, we probably focus less on that, but it's a really good point, Allison. As we get closer to the legislature, there will be opportunities to reconcile.
But that's what I like about the proposal, is just that it envisions the full range of housing, and certainly we need that affordable piece. That's a huge it's such a huge great need, and so I like that it envisions having the full range of housing opportunities and home ownership opportunities as part of the mix. So I look forward to seeing where this goes this session, and also helping to get word out to the coalition about how they can be engaging in this. So thanks everyone.
The other point I'd make is this is not exclusive to, I mean, if you're building an affordable unit, you can be a for-profit entity. It's really the outcome at the end. So it doesn't exclude anyone from the development production side of the equation at any level, as long as they meet the requirements for affordability. So in some respects, it improves opportunity for the entire development spectrum.
One other point about this in terms of that opportunity is that this works both as a baffle, if you will. In hot development areas, it helps preserve affordability. But in areas where we see transit investment and not the housing that would help make that transit make sense, this is a huge commitment of riders and therefore consumers and people on the street and infrastructure that may signal to developers, oh, the government cares about that area. We're going to start putting in market housing as well. So it can both, preserve affordability in hot markets, but also create market housing in areas that are affordable. And I think that, makes the whole system work better. So it's not all focused in a few locations. So, but that's part of why we've come to appreciate the richness of this tool as we've sort of worked with different communities. Thank you all for your time. We will follow up. Jesse, we can send people sort of a copy of the deck and the links again, so they have it and things like that. And we are eager, if you want us to present to other groups you're connected with, sign on and support. So we have you you know, as a name on the list, or even to testify, or, you know, you can choose your own involvement. We will welcome it all. If you get thought with a question or, oh, why didn't I ask that question? Please feel free to reach out afterwards to us. We look forward to it. So there's my contact information. It'll be at the end as well. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.